Hello and welcome to Top Gear. This week we've gone east, young man. In fact, we've come to Poland. This is one of Warsaw's most beautiful old city squares. Now, of course, you can't mention Warsaw or Poland these days without recalling the drama, if you like, of the past 2 or 3 years. The rise and fall of solidarity, the imposition of martial law, the plunging of the Polish economy into crisis with this massive dollar debt to the West of $24 billion with diminishing ability to repay. So in a sense, the drama continues. Poland, if you like, is walking a tightrope. But even as it does so, life, of course, goes on. Buses and trams run, shops open, people get up in the morning to get their kids off to school and get themselves off to work. And we've come here specifically to look at a slice of Polish life going on. So let's start by looking at the Polish car industry. Now, it isn't a particularly significant industry as far as Britain's concerned. It exports something like 8,000 cars a year into our market. It is a very typical example of a little observed, a little written about piece of the motoring world, the East European car industry. But I think it's important to understand right from the start the radically different view towards the car in the West and the East. In the West, of course, the car companies are massive. They're dominating pillars, if you like, of the industrial society. They're rapidly churning out cars so that anyone who can scratch together the pennies or pounds to buy one can have one. That is fundamentally not so in the East. However much people may want private cars, the official view is they should travel around on public transport. Cars are something of a luxury to be waited for even years if necessary. This is the FSO factory on the outskirts of Warsaw, one of 2 factories that really make up the Polish car industry. They employ about 12,000 people here. Their production is down to around 85,000 units a year. The name of the game in making cars is to sell them to the West to earn hard currency. And it's in that context we should see what's going on inside this factory. They make 2 basic cars here. One is a variation of the old Fiat 125, formerly called the Polski Fiat, now the FSO 1300 or 1500. They started making it under license in the late 60s. They're still making it and selling it, not only to their own market and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, but also to the UK, mainly, I think, because of its very competitive price, under £3,000. So a lot of car there for the money, although, despite its many modifications, it's still, of course, a very dated car. And then, since 1978, they've produced the Polonez, which is really a smarter and more fashionable hatchback design, wrapped around essentially the same mechanicals, with a number of extras like electronic ignition and carburetor preheat to improve the performance and make it more attractive in the West. But basically, 2 models then that they're struggling to keep up to date, and in exactly the same way they're desperately concerned to bring their production line up to date with robots. The Polonez body construction line is largely automated with a system bought from the Italians about 7 years ago. These robots haven't made a fantastic improvement in productivity. The plant is still working only something like 70% of its potential throughput. It still takes 51 hours to make a Polish car as opposed to around 25 hours for a Japanese one. Although that isn't as significant as it might at first seem, because wages here, of course, are still very low. The average worker here takes around 13,000 zlotys home a month, around £90, and they are in fact top of the heap in Poland. The real significance of the robots is they've enormously increased the reliability of the world, and that's important. They want to go on selling these cars in the West. This is another critical point in the production line where the engine meets the body shell. They're set up on what are called carousel units that are manoeuvred round, and then they're carefully hoisted up into position and bolted home, all in a matter of minutes. It's not the newest system in the world, but neither is it by any means the oldest. And many car workers in the UK would recognise this very system. But if you look at the wider picture, they're clearly in something of a catch-22 situation. They desperately need a new model if they're going to expand or indeed retain their markets in the West. They also need a much wider plant modernisation programme, because really we've only shown you the best bits. They can only buy those things with hard currency. They can only earn that hard currency by selling more of these rapidly aging models in the Western market. So in a sense, a closed loop. Can they break out of that closed loop, I ask myself, by concluding a deal, a new deal, with, say, a Japanese company who want themselves to break into a wider East European market? In fact, I understand they are now carrying out negotiations with a Japanese company. OK, now let's for a moment go back to England, where Sue Baker is test driving the cars imported into the UK.
Out of every 100 new cars sold in Britain are one of these, the Eastern European cars, or what the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders loosely term as the others. Well, we have four of the most popular here: the Zastava Yugo 45 from Yugoslavia, the Skoda Rapid Coupe from Czechoslovakia, the Lada Riva from Russia, and this one, the FSO Polonez from Poland. The Polonez is the most up-to-date model from the company who have been importing cars to Britain since 1975. It is a clumsy, crudely finished car. It steers and brakes adequately well, but not particularly impressively, and everything it does is, one might say, adequate. It has a 1500cc four-cylinder engine with a power output of 82 brake horsepower. That will get you up to 90 miles an hour, but you really feel like the car's struggling to do it. And the 0 to 60 acceleration time of 19 seconds is the giveaway to that. It's a comparatively sluggish car up through the gears. There are other disadvantages to it as well. It has to be put in for service every 6,000 miles. That's twice as frequent as is now the current norm for most European cars. And it has a comparatively high cost of insurance. It rates Group 5 on the Lloyd's scale, and that's much higher than I would have expected for a car of this type. It's not very impressively finished. There's nothing about it that you get into the car and particularly feel you like. And I think this is probably a car for somebody who doesn't have a very wide motoring experience, who perhaps has owned an elderly second-hand car before, or is buying their new car for the very first time. Because if you've driven a wide variety of cars, you do realise just what the shortcomings of this one are.
Well, back here in Warsaw, I said a moment ago that in Eastern Europe, and certainly in Poland, the car is seen very much as a luxury item, something you have to learn to wait for. Indeed, when you ask here what you have to get your hands on a car, the normal answer you get is great patience. They might perhaps add as well a lot of zlotys. That's the Polish form of currency, because of the enormous cost of the car in relation to average annual earnings. The little Fiat 126, for example, costs 250,000 zlotys, that's about £2,000. But it represents 2 full years' work for the average Polish worker. The slightly larger Fiat 125 costs 500,000 zlotys, or 4 years' work. And the smoother, upmarket Polonez 1500 costs fully 650,000 zlotys, or over 5 years' wages. There are a lot of people walking around on the streets of Poland today who believe they'll never be able to afford to buy a car because it's so much like hanging an albatross around your neck, particularly with all the problems they're having with spares and batteries and tyres and so on. But even despite that, you decide to go ahead, then you can open a bank account in a bank like this, something like a mortgage account, into which you pay by deposits up to 15% of the value of the car. Now that bank account number doesn't actually entitle you to a car, nothing as lucky as that. It entitles you to a year in which you should get your car. It might be 1985, 1986 and so on. That one young man we spoke to said that he would be married and have his children before he received his car in 1987. So buying a car for the average worker in Poland is clearly a very big decision indeed. Then what happens on that great day when your car finally arrives is that you, of course, have to stump up the rest of the money, which by that time, with inflation and so on, is much more than the original 50%. Now, if you happen to be one of the lucky few who has the ready cash in his hand, then you can come to a depot or a showroom like this, run by Polonez. Polonez is the marketing arm, if you like, of the manufacturing organisation, and there's a network of these showrooms around the country. There's no actual display of cars in the Western sense because, of course, nobody's trying to sell anybody anything. It's much more matter-of-fact and down-to-earth, if you like. One snag is that you have to have the money at least half in hard currency and the rest in zlotys, and if you can manage to arrange that, you can short-circuit the system. You may not get the colour you want, but you will get your car within, say, 2 months. You can even order foreign cars from one of these showrooms. I'm told Ladas and Mazdas are pretty popular. The drawback there is the cars must be lower than 1300cc engines because the official organisation can't import cars with engines larger than that. But you can. Indeed, you can import a Mercedes or a Rolls-Royce if you want, provided you can pay the import duty. And as the official said to me with heavy irony when asked him the question, that would be considerable. So, if new cars are difficult to come by, what about the second-hand car market? Well, there isn't one, at least not in any structured sense, because as the government controls the marketing of new cars, it has no mechanism really for dealing with second-hand cars. You can't trade your car in Poland. So if you want to buy a second-hand car, you can look at the ads in the newspapers, or you can go along to one of the new second-hand car markets that are springing up on Sundays. A street on the outskirts of Warsaw, for example, becomes a day-long traffic jam on Sundays, and you can go along there and drive a hard bargain with hard or soft currency. Although bargain is something of a misnomer because Poland's the only country in the world where a second-hand car costs more than a new one, simply because new cars are so scarce. And you have to be very careful because there's no easy way in Poland of telling a car's age. There's no year-by-year registration tag. So there it is, buying a car in the Warsaw jungle, as it were. Certainly a test of patience and initiative. Okay, so you've saved up your zlotys and finally acquired your car. What's life like on the roads of Warsaw for the average driver? Well, in many ways, of course, it's like driving in any other capital. There's a 50-kilometre or 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. Although when we drove at that speed, I noticed we were passed, as elsewhere, on either side by drivers travelling faster than that. There's no seatbelt legislation yet, although I'm told that's coming in sometime next year. But in many ways, it really is an entirely different ball game driving in this city. For a start, there's acres of space on the roads. Indeed, it's one of the few cities I've driven in where there's nothing like a morning rush hour. Drinking and driving laws here are very strict. Something like half a pint or one vodka will put you over the limit, so people tend to observe those regulations, or if they do drink, call up a radio taxi. If you do break that speed limit I mentioned, then you can be stopped and fined on the spot by a policeman. It can be anything from 500 zlotys up to 5,000 zlotys, depending on the severity of the offence. So that's up to 2 weeks' wages, so obviously it's a very serious thing to get involved in. Policemen I notice here, very young, younger than in most other cities, mainly perhaps because the 18-year-old volunteers here are given the chance of going into the army or the police, and they often opt for going into the police force. But perhaps the most important difference about driving here and elsewhere in the world is that petrol here is rationed. How does it work? Well, if you've got a car over 900 cc's, you get an allowance of 3 coupons a month, each worth 50 litres, a total of 45 litres a month, about 12 gallons, I suppose. Then you can get extra coupons either on a permanent basis if you're a professional journalist or a doctor or a manager, or on a temporary basis if you happen to be travelling around your company. What's the total effect of all that? Well, it's obviously led to a lot of the space on the roads here, particularly at weekends, cutting out travelling to your relatives and so on. It's also led to a healthy black market, with fuel being siphoned out of one tank into another for a fistful of dollars. It's also one of the main reasons for the massive efforts here to develop a diesel engine, because although there's not a big differential in terms of diesel petrol prices, diesel is unrationed. But that really is another story. And before we get to it, let's go back to England to Sue Baker, who's carrying out 2 more car tests.
This is the top of a range of 5 models which Skoda of Czechoslovakia sell on the British market. And this one's called the Rapid Coupe. And it does have a comparatively quick top speed, 95 miles an hour, although it takes rather a long time chugging its way up there. It has a 1200cc engine mounted at the back of the car, and with the radiator up at the front end. Now, in some ways, there are similarities between this car and the Lada. Both have a similarly rustic feel and look about them. But in other ways, it's rather different because the steering of this car is extremely light. You might almost believe that it was power-assisted steering. It doesn't have much feel to it, rather woolly, but extremely light and easy to use. And likewise, the gearbox. It floats easily from gear to gear, rather like stirring syrup, not a very pleasant gear change, but it's very easy and you don't need brawny muscles to use it. The inside of the car is extremely old-fashioned looking, black and rather heavy, and very thick, old-fashioned heavy switches which really turn the clock back by about 15 years. Now, Skoda ran into severe troubles when they first brought this range to the British market. The cars were very heavily criticised for their poor handling, and the Department of Transport were not at all satisfied with the way the cars did handle. As a result of which, some substantial modifications were organised with the independent assistance of engineers from the Automobile Association. The handling of the cars is now deemed perfectly acceptable, although to anyone who's used to a more modern European car, it's not what you would call a good handling car. This is s11e7's Yugo 45 from Yugoslavia, and it differs in two ways from most of the other Eastern European cars sold in Britain. Not only is it a good deal smaller, but it's also much more modern in feel to drive than any of the others. It's only just under 11.5 feet long, so it fits into the super mini category up against cars like the Fiesta and Metro. And this one has a 900cc Fiat engine driving the front wheels, and that's the key, I think, to its much better handling than the others that I've been looking at. It's not a full 5-seater, it's a rather cramped 4, but on the road it does feel sprightly and lively. It has reasonable performance up to 85 miles an hour, good braking, and most particularly it handles nicely, it corners well, and I think to anyone who's used to driving modern cars it feels very much better. Now, this car represents a big jump forward for s11e7 because when they first came into the British market, they did so with cars that earned them not a very good reputation and were not at all well thought of. This car deserves to get them a rather better name, and they've also protected it with a 3-year anti-corrosion warranty, which is another good encouragement.
Right, well, back here in Poland, now undoubtedly the signing of that licensing agreement with the Italians back in the late 60s to build the then Fiat 125 was the great lift-off point, if you like, for the Polish car industry. And that technique, signing a licensing agreement with a foreign company, has been used with great skill throughout the 70s to build up as rapidly as possible a bigger range of vehicles to take to the world market. This truck, for example, one of the latest to come off the production line at Jelcz here, is based very largely on the licensing agreement signed with Stade Proof of Austria, using, interestingly, a British Leyland engine. In the same way, the buses down there, based on the design licensed from Berliet in France, again, interestingly, using British Leyland engines. Now, as far as cars are concerned, one of the big successes has been the little Fiat 126. Over 150,000 a year produced in the factory in southern Poland, cheap and economical, of course, still sold in the West despite the introduction of the Fiat Panda. With the 125, the real name of the game has been to constantly modify it, to try and keep up with the rest of the pack. So they've given it a rejigged rear axle, a completely maintenance-free drive shaft. They've modified the camshaft and carburetor to boost the horsepower now to 82. The next big step is to introduce the Polonez engine and 5-speed gearbox. But the real engine story here is down at the end of the line under the bonnet of the Polonez diesel. Now, I mentioned earlier the big attraction of a diesel engine in this country because diesel oil here is unrationed. There's also a 20% price differential, as elsewhere in the world, although not, of course, in the UK. So they're having a go here with the Italian engine. The VM2000 turbo diesel, the same engine, incidentally, is fitted into the Rover diesel. It adds slightly to the weight of the car, but because it's a 2-litre engine, instead of the standard 1.5, the performance is very similar. But the real snag, of course, as far as this engine is concerned, is that it costs hard currency, $2,200, as the Italians have specified, for engine and gearbox. And that would add enormously to the price of the car, whatever market it's sold in. That's why there's been a massive concern to try and design an integral Polish diesel engine. They've spent 2 years at it so far. It must be 3, 4, even more years away before it goes onto production line. So they're casting around as well for other engines in the world that might prove a suitable combination. They're looking, in fact, at the Isuzu 1800cc diesel engine. So wherever you look, that Japanese connection seems to get stronger and stronger. So having looked at the Polish car industry, where do they sell their cars overseas? Well, of course, it's easier to sell them in Eastern Europe and in the Third World, but the market they're really after is the Western world, the hard currency world.
UK market is very important for us. He is on the third position among all the Western countries.
Is that market increasing or decreasing?
This market is increasing. That is, together we hope to export more than 8,000 units this year on the United Kingdom market.
How do you react to the charge, Mr. Vazeka, that you're basically buying your way into the UK market by underpricing your cars, by, if you like, dumping your cars at an unrealistic price?
That this accusation, I think this word maybe is not quite all right, because we are following the rules of the market. That means I think that our car is competitive.
But the price bears no relation to the price of the same car sold in Poland. I mean, it's something like a third of the price of the same car in Poland.
I would say rather that we operating on many markets, we try to get an average price for the factory, an average hard currency price, and we, on some markets, we get better prices. Of course, I can tell you that outside Europe, our prices are much higher than in Europe. In Europe, the prices are lower because the competition is stronger. But the average for the factory is rather good.
Mr. Pieczek, we've been round the factory. Why is the productivity per man so low?
Przede wszystkim
It is absolutely true that we are not fulfilling the full production program. You must have noticed in our factory quite good technology on some assembly lines, which comes from the 1970s. But we are well into the 1980s, so this technology, this system of automation, is becoming more and more obsolete. We believe that the new car to be produced in the factory in the future will bring along new technology and higher output, therefore allowing us to increase the productivity per person employed.
You mentioned a new car. Where will your next new car come from?
jest kilka możliwości.
There are several possibilities. We are working in this factory on a new model to be constructed by our own engineers. This is a possible solution.
I to jest jedna droga.
The second is a cooperation with one of our Eastern European business partners.
Oczywiście
The third is cooperation with a reputable producer from Western Europe or Japan. Which of these three possibilities will finally be chosen and become true? It's unfortunately too early to say.
Rozmawiamy w związku z tym.
Our own construction will certainly take 4, possibly 5 years.
Rozmawiamy również.
However, if we decide for what I called cooperation, then I would say that we could be producing the cars within 2 to 2.5 years.
Well, you don't have to look very far between the lines of the managers and directors we spoke to here to see that they are quite a long way down the road towards concluding a deal with the Japanese. Indeed, a Japanese car could be rolling off Polish lines within a shorter time as 3 or 4 years. Now, if that did happen, it'd be like Christmas morning for the English end of the FSO operation, Automotive Distributors Limited, because they already have a Japanese distributorship, that of Mazda. Indeed, John Ebenezer, the manager of ADL, said to us that, of course, these cars aren't the hottest thing since sliced bread. The reason they sell in the UK is because they are so competitively priced, because they offer so much for so little. Their competitive market, he agrees, is really the second-hand Ford, but enough people prefer to buy an old-fashioned car, because it's a new one, to make the operation profitable. Now, staying in England, let's go back to Sue Baker for her last car test, that indeed of the Lada.
This is the Lada Riva, launched for the British market earlier this year, but based on a very much older design. This car is built in Russia at Togliatti from a design originated by Fiat back in the 1960s and now built under license. Now, the Russians have changed it somewhat. They've curved off the edges of the bodywork, tidied that up a bit, and in this latest version, it has a 1300cc single overhead camshaft engine. That's uprated from the car that was originally run on an 1100cc engine. They've also added a laminated windscreen, a 21-piece toolkit, and so they've done some things that are worthwhile to it. But you still feel when you drive this car as if it was built for a big beefy Russian who has plenty of muscles, because the steering has a sloppy and imprecise but rather heavy feel to it. The gearbox has a very chunky feel and you have to thrust it into gear. And the brakes, I'm afraid, I think, leave something to be desired, because you have to stamp very hard on them to make them stop. And it doesn't feel to me as if it has as much stopping power as I'd like. There's also the fascia here, which is rather Spartan, very black and heavy looking. And the interior trim looks as though it's held together with far too many rather obvious screws. Whatever else you may think of these cars, you have to admit they are very cheap to buy. They range in price from £3,000 to £4,000. The little Yugo at the end is £3,300, the Skoda £3,400, the Lada Riva is the cheapest at £3,075, and this one, the Polonez, is the dearest at almost £3,900. Now, for those prices, they are well equipped. The Riva, for example, even has headlamp wash wipers, which are normally only found on much more expensive cars. And of course, the other point to be remembered about any of these cars is that they may be very cheap to buy initially, but they tend not to hold their value well on the second-hand market.
Well, that really brings us to the end of this special programme from Poland. Now, one can't, of course, in a visit of this length, get any comprehensive grasp of a national industry. But it's clear, it seems, that the Polish motor industry is struggling to regain its balance, aware that its cars and its factories are running out of time, desperately searching around, if you like, for a new partner to bring in new models and new technologies. Now, if that partner turns out to be Japan, as it seems to do, then I think we could see Japan not only breaking into Eastern Europe, but flooding Western Europe with a whole new range of cheap cars under a different guise, as it were. As for Poland itself, well, I think the managers and even the workers we spoke to seem to think the light at the end of the tunnel lay in their real attempts now to break down the old centralised control of the economy. Managers now have much more say in their own destiny, much more control of their own factories. The reward for workers can be more closely tied to their real efforts. They are seeing their hope lying in seeding a little bit of capitalism into the existing socialist system. Now, next week, we're off to look at quite a different kind of socialism, Swedish socialism, and how the Swedish motorist tries to cope with the plethora of regulations designed to control him. A lot of interesting stories, so see you then. Until then, drive safely. Good night.
Tomorrow evening, BBC One visits the motor fair at London's Earl's Court, where Chris Searle and Sue Ingle will be taking a look at the exciting displays of new and restyled cars, collectors' cars and accessories. Motor fair